name is Josh McMullen. I'm an architect here at GlideFast, and with me is Toan Tran. Toan.
Hello, everyone. I'm Toan Tran, ATC at GlideFast, and I'll be going over the development process of this wonderful project today.
Today's agenda, we're going to be looking at goals and objectives, talking about, what brought this solution to the customer, why we did it, giving an overview of how we implemented it, the challenges we faced, and then at the end, Toan will give a live demo of the solution that we implemented. So really, goals and objectives. Why did we want to embed Power BI into Service Portal? So this was a CSM contract, and this customer had their clients buy into them. As part of the buy-in, they received reports from the company that showed their ROI. So they could see that the customer was utilizing the product in a method that was returning back what they bought from them. And it was actually a really good use case for CSM. The ability to show ROI is something that can easily help build your customer base. So in doing this, they wanted all of the aggregated data they had put into Power BI to be displayed into the CSM portal in ServiceNow. So there were two types of reports that we would be running. There would be the row level security RLS reports, which were reports that were shared across multiple customers. That what would happen is as the user pulled up the page, it would pass in data to that report and filter it down to just the data they're allowed to see, and non-RLS reports, which are the reports associated to specific clients. So we're going to walk through how we set up the OAuth and credentialing, the Power BI REST API, and using ServiceNow's Flow Designer Integration Hub to perform the REST API calls. The prerequisites as we go through this, of course, we're going to need, a service principal account that can access Power BI. So this account, there are two methodologies when going through Power BI. There's service principal, which you can think of as an individual user account that has access to read and write versus the admin account. When we were going through this, the customer had only ever implemented any integrations with Power BI utilizing admin. So one of our big challenges was getting them to set us up as a service principal. So that way we didn't need to see everything. We were only seeing what we needed to see. So with a service principal, we have to ensure proper permissions and access have been granted such that that principal could see what it needed to. We need to set up workspaces. So in Power BI, you can set up individualized areas where you put these reports, and those are called workspaces. They have a unique identifier of a workspace ID. And when doing all of this, we have to pull that workspace ID in such that the service principal knows where to. Of course, they will need to build and store the reports, and then setting up RLS. That is held in Power BI. So over there, they will set up basically a table just like we set up ACLs. So they can set up RLS where it takes a user, says you can read this data, and what we would do then is pass in that user information to their system. It would filter the report and pass it all back to us. And then we have a link here to the Power BI documentation. And then the implementation plan, establish connection, pass the necessary data, using the report data obtained, embed it, and then install the plugin. So realistically, it sounds easy. It was not. This is one of those projects that we churned for weeks trying to understand Microsoft's API documentation and what calls need to make. There would be 4 documents that all say different things, all trying to accomplish the same goal. So it was a lot of back and forth, and understanding how Power BI actually works. So when we go through these individual steps, you'll see we have to make 3 calls just to get a single report out. So we use OAuth, Flow Designer, Integration Hub, and Service Portal. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Toan.
Alrighty. So to first begin, we obviously had to establish a connection between ServiceNow and Power BI's Microsoft Analytics services. And to begin with that, we had to create an OAuth record through the application registry module. And first and foremost, we just had to locate that module, open it up, and create a new record. Upon creating a new record, you want to select the option of connecting to a third-party OAuth provider. And then from there, all you have to really do is input in the client ID and client secret, which should be provided to you from the Azure AD app from the prereqs, as well as the tenant ID, which you will input into the token URL based on the URL you're seeing in the slide right now. And then afterwards, go ahead and just set the default grant type to client credentials. And this OAuth application registry is to help us pass in our calls through a basic authorization header. And that's why we're setting in the credentials or setting the send credentials as basic authorization header. Everything else should be as default. Next slide. Aside from that, within the application registry record, there is a field called OAuth util script. And so what we want to do is go and locate the actual original OAuth util script, since it's an out-of-box script. And we want to pretty much override this script to also include a header that points our preprocessed access token to the resource that Power BI uses to run their REST API calls. And so we went into the OAuth util script and created a copy of it using insert and stay. And we just titled it OAuth util Power BI. And then within the preprocessed access token function, we just override it by adding in a line that simply just puts a key value pair of resource as key and then value as the Power BI REST API resource URL. And once we go ahead and save that and point the new script into the application registry record, you'll notice here all the red squares are fields that we had to fill in manually. The rest were all set by default. And so here, client ID, client secret, and then the new API script that we insert and stay, as well as a default grant type, token URL, and send credentials. And notice on the right-hand side here, there is an OAuth entity profile that automatically gets created, which is essentially just the name of your application registry plus default underscore profile. This will be useful later on when we're creating an actual connection when using Integration Hub. So now that we've created an application registry, we now need to establish a connection, the real connection between Power BI and ServiceNow, and that's through Integration Hub. And since we're using Integration Hub, we need to use the connection and credential aliases module. So first, we need to go to that module, create a new record simply by just naming that record. That's the first step. As you can see here, we just titled it Power BI CCA, which is connection and credential alias. Afterwards, within that record, at the very bottom, there is a connections related list. Essentially, you just have to create a new connections. And within that connection, just name it whatever you like. We named it Power BI connection. Under that is a field called credential. Essentially, you just want to create a new OAuth credential to connect to the REST API. So you would want to hit the magnifying glass, which will open up a new window where you can also create a new credential record. And when it asks for what type of credential record you want to select the OAuth 2.0 credentials record, and you just have to name the record. Afterwards, once you name the record, you'll notice that there is an OAuth entity profile that you need to select. And that's essentially that profile that we just mentioned from earlier, where you just type in the name of your application registry and an auto suggestion will be pointed out where it's the name of your registry plus the term default underscore profile. Go ahead and select that first option and submit. And when you submit, you'll notice that your connection alias has been set. And then for the connection URL, you just have to put in api.powerbi.com/v1.0/myorg. And then your credential obviously was set from earlier as well. So once the connection and alias has been established, we can finally go ahead and begin the REST calls. For our REST calls, we decided to create a custom action that makes two REST calls. One is a get and another is a post. Not sure why they're not both gets, but that's just how the APIs work. So the first get will help us obtain the embed URL, which we will later pass on into a custom iframe to display the report. And then the post gives us an access token, which we will use to actually allow us to display the report from the embed URL. So the first step is to create a custom action. And we just went to title list, for example, Power BI report data pool, and then create two inputs that are mandatory, because these are the two inputs we need to pass into both REST calls. The first one is group ID, which is another word for workspace ID. That should be established from the prereqs from earlier. And then the report ID is whichever report we need to. So the first step is to make the first get call. And so we need to set the connection alias, which we established from earlier, and then set the resource path to groups / and then whatever the group ID is / reports, and then / whatever the report ID is. And then making sure that you set your HTTP method to get. And next slide. After you make your get call, you should be returned with a JSON response as seen below, where you will receive a dataset ID, an ID of the report, the name of the report, web URL, and embed URL. So we will later store the embed URL, and also, depending on what type of report you're pulling, if it's a non-RLS report, it's not needed. But if it's an RLS report, we will also need to store the dataset ID. But using the JSON parser, we're able to just store every object that's returned back to us and store it as a data pill. So the next step is another REST step. So this one is the post, and this one allows us to generate that access token to give us the ability to display the reports. So again, it's a very similar setup. It's the same connection alias from earlier, and then the resource path is pretty much the same as well, with the addition of /generate token at the end, and then your HTTP method should be post. And then make sure that you also set a header key value pair of content type to application /JSON. And that's to ensure that our REST call is in the JSON format. And then going back to what I was discussing earlier, if we're using RLS report, we need to also pass in the dataset ID into the request body. Otherwise, there are no additional inputs except for passing in the input of access level is view. That makes sure that the reports we're pulling in cannot be modified from ServiceNow by accident. They should just be read only. And based on the service principal that we set up, it automatically should already be read only, but that's just to be safe. And then for RLS reports, you need to add into the request body a username, the report ID, the dataset ID, which is from the get call as well, and the roles, which will allow whoever is accessing the report the proper data that they're supposed to see. So this first image shows what the setup will look like if it's a non-RLS report. It's very straightforward. But this one, the RLS report, the only difference is the request body, where now we're also including an identity, which is whoever the user is that's accessing the report. And upon that is the dataset ID, which is the data that the report will be accessing, as well as the role, which helps filter down what data the user is supposed to see. For our example for today, we will be displaying a non-RLS report. And the next step in our custom action is to parse the response from our second REST call, which responds back with just a token ID, and then an expiration date time. We will mainly focus on using the token to help with the displaying of our Power BI report. So finally, once you have set up these 4 steps, your final step is to create an output. We created 2 outputs, which is the embed URL obtained from the first REST step, and the embed token, which is obtained from the second REST step. Once we go ahead and complete this action, for our demo's sake, we are using the code snippet generated from the custom action. to be used later on for displaying and calling the Power BI REST API from the portal. However, in our demo, we will actually be showing a custom flow, a custom subflow that uses this custom action. And from the subflow, we're actually using the snippet from there. And we can show you that later on in the demo. Alrighty, so this will be the part where we will be displaying the Power BI reports. So I'll go ahead and hand that back to Josh.
Perfect. So as part of this, since we are embedding these in Service Portal, we had to kind of come up with the solution of how do we make these calls and how do we get the data when we need it. Part of the big issue was we can't just make daily calls to get all this information, store it locally in a table and display it when needed. These all had to be just-in-time calls. So as a user goes to open a report, all of this happens, all the flows that Toan just walked through get called instantly in the portal when they click the button for show the report. Due to RLS, we have to check their security over and over again. And even on non-RLS, if they refresh the report, we need it live right then. So to do that, Power BI has special code that is required to make it work. So we had to include a new JS include in our portal, which is the Power BI centric code. In doing that, it basically will give the widget that we are using in portal the ability to make the calls to Power BI and re-display the report in portal. So to create a new JS include, you go to your theme in Service Portal, you scroll down to the bottom, there should be a related list called JS includes, and you're going to create a new one. In there, you can put this URL of Microsoft GitHub IO, and this will allow you to make this Power BI centric calls. So in here, you can see we are doing embed report. So this is our HTML template. One of the big things that we were running into is loading times. Since this is doing live calls right then and there, we had to put in some loading stops to make sure that we weren't just sitting there and spinning on the page. So we did a couple of tricks in there to make it load the entire page, then go back and make the calls. So we can get a nice little loading screen for the user. It's a better experience for them. And as you can see, the HTML is very just bland. The one thing that really matters is the ID of report container. This report container is what Power BI will find and will then repurpose to put the report into. We also implemented security such that if you are not associated to the report on our side, because our reports are stored in relationship to the individual accounts, we would stop before we even try and make the call. This was to add better security just in case there was a miss up on the other side. We wanted to have a second level just so we're not accidentally unblinding data for other clients, especially if someone shares a URL of a report that they weren't supposed to share. This will stop that. So this is where we embed the report utilizing the code snippet that Toan just showed. So we just grab that code snippet, we reformat it, just make it a little cleaner to read, easier to understand. And then we pass that into the server script of the widget. So let's go to the next slide. Here's just how we put it in there. So you can see we're doing a quick check of if they're allowed to see this report. We validate our security. And then if we are allowed to see it, we get the report parameter of ID. This we will show in a second of is an asset. We stored these reports as assets associated to the accounts in a contract. And so then when you click on a report, it looks up the asset record, grabs the report ID out of it, passes all of that into our subflows, and then makes the calls to get all of our items to pass back into the client script and then parse it into the HTML. So using code samples from the Power BI playground, the sample has been modified to just basically, API calls can be delayed. So we just got to wait for them. So here's our client script. So you can see here, very high level, we're doing a timeout. This is to allow the page to load so that we don't get a blank screen with a tiny little bitty loading in the top left. So we let the entire page load and then we go back to make our calls. So once we're done loading, we get all of our config here. You can see this is where we get all of our data back from those flows. We put it in there, we tell it our Power BI information, which you can see here, this Power BI.embed. This is utilizing that special Power BI code that comes from the JS include. We give it the report container, which is the same ID as the div that is in our HTML, as well as the config we just defined from making our REST calls. This will allow Power BI to go look up that div by ID and reload it with the report. So in here, we set our container that's holding the report to be fluid, just so it gets the full width and full page. This realistically in Portal, drag a container on there, put our widget in there, set the container to fluid so that it gets full width. And then as you can see here, whenever we navigate to our page, you can see here in our URL, this is our report ID parameter that we were using. And this, like I said, is an asset record that stores our individual report configuration that can then be pulled out and then display the report directly into the portal. So before we hop into demo, is there any high-level questions about how all of this works? All right. And so as a note for Tom, this next section of demo is from a client instance. So we'll have to pause the recording so that we can demo this out.